freezing rain over Manhattan felt like needles against Kaelen Park's skin as he stepped out of his Maybach, but the cold was nothing compared to the ice that shattered in his chest when he saw the boy. Huddled under a rusted subway overhang, a 5-year-old child with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that were a haunting, identical match to Kaelen's own obsidian gaze looked up, clutching a tattered blanket. This wasn't just a random beggar, this was a living ghost, a child who carried the unmistakable lineage of the Park dynasty in every sharp line of his face. Before Kaelen could even breathe, a woman's scream tore through the thunder, a voice he hadn't heard since he was forced to choose between his billions and his heart 6 years ago. Amara Vance emerged from the shadows, her clothes worn and soaked, throwing herself in front of the boy like a shield against the man she once loved. "Don't you touch him, Kaelen," she hissed, her voice a lethal mix of agony and defiance that stopped the heart of the world's most powerful CEO. "You chose your empire. You don't get to claim the son you never wanted. If you're ready to see a billionaire's world crumble as he fights for the family he threw away, subscribe now and hit the notification bell because this story is just getting started." The neon lights of New York blurred as Kaelen stood frozen, the rain soaking his $5,000 suit, his mind reeling from the impossibility of the moment. For 6 years, he had lived in a gilded cage of his own making, believing Amara had vanished into the District of Columbia with a payout from his mother, but the truth was standing in front of him, shivering in the cold. The boy, Leo, gripped his mother's hand, his small knuckles white, staring at Kaelen with a maturity that felt like a physical blow to Kaelen's pride. Every corporate battle he had won, every billion-dollar acquisition he had executed in Washington and New York, felt like ash in his mouth as he realized he was looking at the $500 billion heir to his throne living on the streets. He tried to speak, but the words were trapped behind a wall of regret, his hand trembling as he reached toward the child who didn't even know his name. Amara didn't flinch, she stood her ground, her beautiful features hardened by years of survival, a stark contrast to the soft, laughing woman Kaelen had known in their youth. "We don't need your pity, and we certainly don't need your money," she spat, her eyes burning with a fire that told Kaelen he was the villain in her story. He watched, helpless, as she began to lead the boy away into the crowd of umbrellas and rushing commuters, the small child looking back over his shoulder one last time. Kaelen felt a surge of desperation, a primal need to bridge the chasm his family had dug between them, but the weight of his sins kept his feet rooted to the pavement. He was the king of the city, yet he had never felt more powerless than he did watching his own flesh and blood disappear into the gray mist of the city. He turned to his assistant, Silas, who was watching with wide eyes from the car, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Find out where they are sleeping tonight. If they spend one more minute in this rain, I'll burn this city to the ground to find them." But that was only the beginning of a war he wasn't prepared to fight. What Silas discovered next changed everything, revealing a secret even more dangerous than the child's existence. Kaelen paced the floor of his penthouse in the heart of Manhattan, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing a city that he supposedly owned, yet all he could see was the shivering frame of the boy in the rain. Silas stood by the mahogany desk, his face pale as he flipped through the digital files he had spent the last 3 hours unearthing through back-channel contacts in Connecticut and Massachusetts. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating Kaelen until he finally turned, his eyes bloodshot with a mix of exhaustion and fury that made Silas take a step back. "Tell me everything," Kaelen commanded, his voice vibrating with the threat of a storm that could level the Park Global Tower. Silas swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he projected a photo of a small, cramped apartment in a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city. "She didn't take the money, sir. Your mother offered her $10 million to leave New York and never look back, but the bank records show the check was never cashed, it was torn up and mailed back to the estate in pieces." Kaelen felt the air leave his lungs as the realization hit him. Amara had chosen poverty over his family's blood money, protecting their son from the very poison that had raised Kaelen. While he was flying private jets to Washington for galas, she was working 3 jobs in California and Washington state just to keep Leo fed, all while hiding from the private investigators his mother had hired to keep them buried. The betrayal of his own flesh and blood was a bitter pill, but the sacrifice Amara had made for his son's soul was a revelation that shattered Kaelen's remaining ego. He looked at the photo of the boy again, noticing the small details, the way Leo held a toy car that looked like a cheap plastic version of Kaelen's Maybach, a tiny spark of connection that broke Kaelen's heart. She's been working as a janitor at one of our subsidiary warehouses in Connecticut, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. The manager there has been, making things difficult for her, sir. He doesn't know who she is, only that she's a single mother with no one to protect her. The rage that erupted in Kaelen was cold and surgical, a dark fire that promised a reckoning for anyone who had breathed the same air as Amara and dared to disrespect her. He grabbed his coat, the charcoal wool feeling like armor, his mind already calculating the quickest way to reach that warehouse before the shift ended. He didn't care about the board meeting in the morning or the merger that was supposed to define his career. The only thing that mattered was the woman who had survived his mother's malice and the boy who was the true king of his empire. As the elevator descended, Kaelen watched his reflection in the polished gold doors, seeing a man he didn't recognize, a man who was willing to lose everything to earn back the right to stand in that child's light. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't touched in half a decade, the ringing tone sounding like a countdown to a war within his own family. "Mother," he said, his voice as sharp as a guillotine when the call connected. "I hope you enjoyed the last 6 years of peace, because tonight, I'm bringing home the grandson you tried to kill." He didn't wait for a response, cutting the line as the doors opened to the garage where his security team was already waiting. He didn't know the truth yet about why Amara was really at that warehouse, but what he found when he arrived changed the stakes of the game forever. The tires of the Maybach screamed against the salt-stained asphalt of the industrial district in Connecticut as Kaelen Park arrived at the subsidiary warehouse, a hulking gray monolith that looked more like a prison than a place of business. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale grease and the deafening roar of conveyor belts, a brutal environment where the high-gloss world of Park Global felt like a distant, cruel myth. Kaelen moved through the shadows of the loading docks, his presence a dark, silent omen that none of the exhausted workers noticed, until his eyes locked onto a small, isolated corner near the shipping crates. There, under the flickering buzz of a failing fluorescent light, Amara was lifting heavy industrial bins, her muscles straining, her face a mask of pure, gritty determination despite the visible exhaustion in her sunken eyes. In a makeshift playpen crafted from discarded cardboard boxes and a threadbare fleece blanket, Leo sat quietly, clutching a broken plastic dinosaur, his eyes wide and watchful as he stayed perfectly silent, a habit born from the necessity of hiding in plain sight. Before Kaelen could move, a man with a protruding gut and a sneer that oozed entitlement, Manager Miller, walked over, kicking the edge of the cardboard playpen and sending the boy's toy skittering across the oil-stained floor. "I told you, Vance, this isn't a daycare," Miller barked, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum like a serrated blade. "You're behind on your quota, and the kid is a liability. One more mistake and you're both on the street for good." Amara dropped the bin, her hands shaking as she moved to protect Leo, her voice a low, desperate plea that broke Kaelen's heart into a million jagged pieces. "He's quiet, Mr. Miller, he doesn't get in the way, please, I just need this shift to pay for his medicine." Miller laughed, a sound so foul Kaelen felt the blood in his veins turn to liquid fire, and the manager reached out to grab Amara's arm to pull her away from the child. He never finished the motion. Kaelen stepped out of the shadows, his hand clamping around Miller's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press, the sound of bone creaking under the pressure of his grip echoing in the sudden, terrified silence of the warehouse. Miller's face went from arrogant to ghostly white in a heartbeat as he looked into the eyes of the man who owned the very air he breathed. "You have 5 seconds to remove your hand from my wife," Kaelen whispered, his voice a low-frequency growl that made the surrounding workers freeze in their tracks. Amara gasped, her eyes flying to Kaelen's, a flicker of hope instantly replaced by the wall of defensive steel she had built over 6 years. "I am not your wife, Kaelen," she snapped, even as she pulled Leo into her arms, the boy looking at the tall, powerful stranger with a mix of awe and recognition. Kaelen didn't look away from Miller, his gaze intensifying until the manager whimpered, falling to his knees as Kaelen's grip tightened. "Silas, by this facility," Kaelen commanded, not breaking eye contact with the man who had dared to touch Amara. "Buy it, fire everyone in management, and ensure Mr. Miller here is blacklisted from every employment agency from Massachusetts to Washington." Silas moved with clinical efficiency, already on his phone, while the rest of the warehouse watched the sudden, violent shift in the universe's order. Kaelen finally let go, Miller collapsing into a heap, and then he turned to Amara, his expression softening into a look of such profound apology it made her breath hitch. He reached out, not for her, but for the boy, his fingers brushing against Leo's soft, curly hair, and for the first time, the $500 billion heir didn't shrink away. He leaned into the warmth of the man who looked just like him. "I'm taking you home," Kaelen said, his voice thick with a promise that felt like a vow. But Amara stepped back, her eyes landing on a black SUV that had just pulled into the loading bay, a vehicle that didn't belong to Kaelen's security team. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a face from Kaelen's past that made the air in the warehouse turn to ice. It wasn't just his mother's reach he had to worry about. A shadow from Amara's lost 6 years was stepping into the light, and he had a gun. The metallic click of a safety being disengaged echoed through the hollow warehouse like a death knell, and Kaelen didn't hesitate for a single microsecond, throwing his massive frame in front of Amara and Leo as the man in the black SUV stepped into the flickering light. Julian Thorne, a name whispered in the darkest corners of the Washington underworld and a man Kaelen knew had been on his mother's payroll for years, leveled a suppressed pistol at Kaelen's chest with a cold, professional indifference that made the air turn to liquid nitrogen. "Step aside, Mr. Park," Julian said, his voice a gravelly rasp that felt like sandpaper on raw nerves. "The lady owes a very specific debt to your mother's estate, and I'm here to collect the collateral. The boy comes with me." Kaelen felt a surge of volcanic rage that threatened to burn through his tailored suit, his eyes narrowing into twin points of lethal obsidian as he realized the depth of the trap his own mother had set for the woman he loved. She hadn't just been left to starve, she had been hunted, forced into predatory loans by Thorne's associates just to pay for Leo's asthma treatments in Massachusetts, a cycle of debt designed to eventually force her to give up the child. Amara's grip on Leo tightened until her knuckles were ghostly white, her breath hitching in a sob that she refused to let fall, a sound that wounded Kaelen more than any bullet ever could. "You won't touch them," Kaelen stated, his voice so calm it was terrifying, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to make the very foundations of the Connecticut warehouse tremble with his authority. He didn't look at the gun, he looked at the man, the CEO's mind already 10 moves ahead in a game Thorne didn't even know they were playing. "Silas, transfer $50 million to Thorne's offshore account in the Caymans right now, and then call the governor of Washington," Kaelen commanded, not breaking eye contact with the assassin. Thorne's finger twitched on the trigger, a flicker of greed competing with the orders from Kaelen's mother, the silence in the warehouse so thick you could hear the frantic beat of Leo's heart. "Money doesn't buy your mother's permission, Kaelen," Thorne sneered, but the confidence in his voice was beginning to fray under the sheer weight of Kaelen's presence. What Thorne didn't know was that Kaelen had already signaled his elite security detail, men who moved like shadows through the shipping crates, their red laser sights suddenly dancing across Thorne's chest like a lethal light show. The power dynamic shifted in a heartbeat, the predator becoming the prey in the span of a single breath, and Kaelen took a step forward, his shadow looming over the man who had dared to threaten his family. "My mother is the past," Kaelen whispered, his voice a promise of total annihilation. "This boy is the future of a $500 billion empire, and you are nothing but a ghost I'm about to exorcise." Thorne's gun hand wavered, the realization dawning on him that no amount of money from a bitter matriarch was worth the wrath of a man who had finally found his soul. With a sharp gesture, Kaelen's men swarmed, disarming Thorne in a blur of tactical precision, while Kaelen turned back to Amara, his heart aching as he saw the terror in her eyes start to melt into a wary, fragile hope. He reached out, and this time, Amara didn't pull away. She let him take the heavy bin from her hand, her fingers brushing against his in a spark of electricity that bridged 6 years of pain. "It's over, Amara," he said, his voice thick with a tenderness that made Leo look up and smile for the very first time. "I'm taking you to the estate in New York, and no one, not even my mother, will ever breathe your name without bowing." But as they walked toward the Maybach, Kaelen saw the look on Silas's face as he stared at his phone, a look of pure, unadulterated horror. What his assistant said next changed everything, proving that the war for the $500 billion heir had only just reached its most dangerous chapter. "Sir," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "Your mother didn't just send Thorn, she just filed for emergency custody in the District of Columbia, and she's claiming Amara is an unfit mother based on these warehouse photos." The air inside the Maybach was thick with a suffocating tension as they sped toward the District of Columbia, the city lights of the East Coast blurring into a frantic streak of neon white and predatory red. Kaelen watched the reflection of his mother's cold, calculated face in his mind, realizing that her filing for emergency custody wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a declaration of total war against the woman who had dared to keep the Park lineage pure from her corruption. Amara sat huddled in the plush leather seat, her arms wrapped tightly around Leo, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his small chest rising and falling with a rasp that reminded Kaelen of every second they had spent in that damp Connecticut warehouse. "She won't take him, Kaelen," Amara whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass that cut through the silence, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon of the highway. "I survived the streets of Washington and the cold of Massachusetts for him. I will burn your entire empire to the ground before I let that woman touch my son." Kaelen reached out, his hand hovering over hers before he finally made contact, his skin burning against the cool silk of her sleeve as he felt the tremors racking her body. "She thinks she's playing a game of chess, Amara, but she forgot that I am the one who built the board," he replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration that promised a reckoning the world would never forget. He pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he mobilized a legal team that cost more per hour than most people made in a decade, ordering them to meet him at the federal courthouse in D.C. before sunrise. Every photo his mother had taken, the cardboard playpen, the oil-stained floors, the thin blankets, was being countered by a digital trail of the millions Kaelen was currently injecting into a trust fund that would make Leo the most powerful child in American history. But the law was a fickle beast, and as they crossed the border into the District of Columbia, a fleet of black government SUVs with flashing blue lights signaled them to pull over, the authority of the state being weaponized by the Park matriarch. Silas gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, his voice tight with a fear he couldn't hide. "Sir, those aren't ours, those are federal marshals executing the emergency removal order." Kaelen felt a surge of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen, his hand tightening around Amara's as the vehicles boxed them in against the concrete barrier of the interstate. He didn't wait for them to approach, he stepped out of the car, his presence looming like a dark god in the middle of the highway, his charcoal suit fluttering in the wind as he stared down the lead officer. "You are standing between a father and his son," Kaelen stated, his voice carrying over the roar of passing traffic with a command that made the marshals hesitate. "If you execute that order, you aren't just taking a child, you are declaring war on a man who owns the very building where you collect your paychecks." The lead marshal looked at the paperwork, then at the ferocious, heartbroken woman stepping out of the car behind Kaelen, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Amara stood tall, the rain from earlier having dried into a wild, regal halo of natural hair, her beautiful face set in a mask of such terrifying maternal power that the officers actually took a step back. "The boy is a Park," Kaelen continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "And in this country, a Park doesn't go into the system, a Park goes home." But that was only the beginning of the night's terror. Just as the marshals began to lower their weapons, a sleek, silver limousine pulled up behind the SUVs, and the back door opened to reveal Madame Park herself, draped in white mink and a smile that was as sharp as a razor. She didn't look at Kaelen, she looked at Amara, her eyes filled with a disgust that had fermented for 6 long years. "It's over, you common girl," the matriarch sneered, her voice like poison dripping into a well. "The boy is coming with me to the estate, and you are going back to the gutter where I found you." What happened next shattered the silence of the night, as Leo woke up and let out a scream that didn't sound like a child's cry, but a call for justice that changed everything. The sound of Leo's voice, a raw, piercing cry of a mommy, and "go away," toward the silver limousine, shattered the icy composure of the federal marshals, their hands falling from their holsters as they looked at the terrified child and then back to the woman in the white mink who looked more like a predator than a grandmother. Kaelen moved like a shadow, pulling Amara and Leo into the circle of his arms, his chest a solid wall of granite as he stared down his mother with a hatred so cold it could have frozen the Potomac River. "You've spent 30 years teaching me that the park name is everything, Mother." Kaelen's voice resonated through the damp DC air, a low-frequency rumble of pure power that made the silver limousine seem to shrink in the darkness. "But tonight, you're going to learn that I am the one who defines it." Madame Park stepped forward, her heels clicking on the asphalt like the ticking of a doomsday clock, her face a mask of aristocratic fury as she waved the legal papers toward the marshals. "Don't listen to his theatrics. That girl is a common thief who stole my grandson, and I will not let the legacy of this family be dragged through the mud of Connecticut warehouses." Amara stepped out from Kaelen's embrace, her head held high, the neon lights reflecting in her dark, defiant eyes as she produced a small, battered digital recorder she had kept hidden in Leo's teddy bear for 6 long years. "I'm not a thief, Madame Park," Amara said, her voice steady and lethal, filling the silence of the highway. "But Julian Thorne is, and his confession of how you paid him to frame me for child neglect is currently being uploaded to every major news outlet in Washington and New York." The color drained from Madame Park's face, her silver mink-clad shoulders slumping as Silas stepped forward, holding a tablet that showed the live feed of the park global stock plummeting as the scandal broke in real time. Kaelen leaned in close to his mother, his whisper a final, crushing blow. "I didn't just transfer $50 million to Thorne, Mother. I paid him to give me the originals of every email and contract you ever signed to ruin Amara's life." The lead marshal, looking at the evidence on Silas's screen, signaled his men to stand down and instead turned his attention to the silver limousine. "Madame Park, your emergency order has been stayed by the federal judge in the District of Columbia, and you are under investigation for conspiracy and kidnapping." The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound Kaelen had ever heard, a stillness that meant the war was finally over and the $500 billion heir was finally safe in his father's light. Kaelen picked up Leo, the boy wrapping his small arms around Kaelen's neck with a trust that healed every scar of the last 6 years, and as the sun began to peek over the Washington skyline, the morning light caught the gold of the courthouse dome as they passed, a symbol of the justice Amara had finally secured for herself and her son. Kaelen looked at the woman beside him, her skin radiant in the first light of the new day, and he realized that her strength was the real foundation of the legacy he had fought to protect. Silas drove in a respectful silence, the Maybach gliding through the streets like a ship navigating through calm waters after the storm of the century. "We aren't going to an estate, Amara," Kaelen whispered, his eyes filled with a love that billion-dollar deals could never buy. "We are going to our home, and today, the world will finally meet the Queen of Park Global." The marshals moved aside, clearing the path for the Maybach as it pulled away from the ruins of the park matriarchy, leaving the cold ghost of the past behind in the gray dawn. As they drove toward their new life, Kaelen watched Leo and Amara in the rearview mirror, realizing that the greatest acquisition of his life wasn't a company, but the family he had almost lost in the rain. This is just the beginning of their new dynasty, if you want to see how Kaelen and Amara rebuild their empire and get their ultimate revenge. Make sure to subscribe and watch the next episode, because the true power of the Park family is finally coming home. The city that once felt like a tomb now looked like a playground for the future, and for the first time in 6 years, Kaelen Park finally knew what it meant to be truly rich.